And in terms of, you mentioned before, the sort of different types of funding you can use to sort of do a buy and build. You mentioned care and education in particular, but what's, obviously private equity love buy and build. It's a great way to deploy capital behind a team that you've sort of backed. What are the pros and cons of equity funding versus other forms of funding, would you say?
Well, it's pretty unusual these days for any of these investments to be pure equity. They're invariably a mix.
Yeah.
The debt markets have been pretty accommodating over the last few years. Obviously, things changing slightly as interest rates generally begin to edge up. But I think any of the transactions one looks at in the market will typically be a balance of equity and debt. In many respects, the debt markets have been sufficiently accommodating, but the criteria, the key requirements of the lenders in terms of covenants and so on are relatively mild, certainly compared with some of the history that I'm familiar with going back 10 years or more when things were a lot more challenging. And as a consequence, only if management teams get it badly wrong, or as we've obviously experienced, when you get a completely unanticipated external shock like COVID, it can throw a business off course. But in general, balanced funding is absolutely fine. I don't think it creates particular problems. Obviously, equity requirements for management teams as incentives are very important. So I think, to me, unless it was an unwieldy position on debt, and there are some examples, again, of platforms going back maybe, say, 10 years or so, where the debt structures were penal, where the servicing costs were incredibly high. And so the businesses would struggle by definition to progress very easily because so much of the free cash flow was being absorbed by servicing costs.
Yeah. And does having an equity funder alongside you kind of help attract or sort of, I suppose, get vendors coming your direction? Does that sort of deliverability factor play a part in sort of a buy and build?
Well, at the risk of alienating the extensive private equity network that I've built up over 20 years, I would say it has almost zero
Really?
value. Building a pipeline of acquisition prospects is something that's driven by the business, by the management team, by the M&A group that any similar business has. It's very rare, particularly in a sector where quite often you're buying individual sites, vet practices, dental clinics, opticians or nurseries, for example. These are typically independent owners. They're not necessarily that business savvy. They're not necessarily connected into the financial community. So there's obviously a fairly active network in the UK, particularly of brokers who present themselves as the intermediaries to promote potential acquisition deals to known buyers. It doesn't tend to get to the stage of involving the PE sponsor unless the deal size is very large. And obviously, if it's very large, then the sponsor would typically come across that through a slightly different level of advisor. But in the main, the vast majority of acquisitions, the origination that's done by businesses is all done internally.
Okay. And is that, in the businesses you've been involved in, has that been a dedicated role for somebody almost to do that sort of M&A acquisition piece, or has it been something that's been part of a member of the management team's sort of day job as well?
No, it's absolutely fundamental that you have a proper M&A resource. And so depending on the size of business and the scale of ambition, you need a proper team. And so to me, it's axiomatic. It also needs to be a part of the business that actually engages with the top management consistently. So in all of the businesses that I've built, the acquisition team would report every Friday to myself, my CFO, and we'd review pipeline, we'd review current deal activity, we'd decide on particular opportunities in terms of submitting proposals and so on. So in a buy and build, I mean, for obvious reasons, if that's the core strategy, it needs to be on the CEO and CFO's desk every day of the week.
Yeah. I think that's something that we've seen probably a trend of more recently. I think it probably it's been apparent in larger buy and builds over the years for a number of times, but now we're seeing more and more businesses sort of take the M&A piece off somebody in the exec team and give it its own sort of dedicated resource, varying levels of seniority, but you've got somebody there that's driving, both targets and also getting deals over the line. It's interesting how that's becoming more and more prevalent.